Well, we've been in a series called Jesus Walks now for, I think this is week 6. So we've been really looking at the life of Jesus. And the reason that we're looking at the life of Jesus is because he is the center of everything when it comes to Christianity. Everything in our faith is centered on this one man named Jesus. And unfortunately, so many Christians don't know about this man, Jesus. We know one or two things. We know that he was born around Christmas time, right? This is what we say. He was born around Christmas time as a virgin, from a virgin. He was a virgin when he was born too, but he was born to a virgin. And then the second thing is that he died on a cross. Those are normally the two things that most Christians know about the man that they're supposed to be following. And so for us to follow someone, we would need to know more than two things about their life, right? We would need to know more than just two things or two events that have happened in their life. And so I gave you this analogy in the beginning, and I'm going to give it to you every week. Whenever I went to Liberty for the first time, I went to tour campus there, Liberty University. I went to tour campus, and I got there early, listened to the instructions about this tour that was coming, and they named off who our tour guides were. And so they said, Jacob, your tour guide's name is John, and there were a bunch of Liberty students all lined up, and they all had on Liberty t-shirts, they had on khaki pants, that kind of thing. And they just said, you guys are going to load up on buses and go with your tour guide. And every tour guide had their own vehicle or bus that we were supposed to load up on. But they didn't tell me who John was. All I knew was that his name was John and that he was going to be showing me around campus. Those were the only two things that I knew, but they didn't tell me who John was. And so because I didn't know who John was, I didn't do anything. I just stood there whenever they told us to go load up on the vehicles because I didn't know who the guy was. I did nothing. And then finally, John turns around and he says, hey, Jacob, you're with me. Come on. So I followed John from that point on, and he showed me we're going on there. But the point is, so many of us don't know this man, Jesus. All we know is his name and normally two events that happened in his life. And then we call ourselves Christians who are, by definition, people who follow him, but we don't know anything about him. We don't know what he did. We don't know what he's expecting and calling us to do. We're missing all these pieces that we're supposed to have to follow this man, Jesus. So that's why we're in this series. And the series is called Jesus Walks. And so we started at Christmas time, and now we're in a new story today. Some of you have probably heard this story, and some of you have probably heard it in a meme form, okay? You've probably heard it in that sense. Tonight we're going to be talking about Jesus cleansing the temple, and this comes from John chapter 2. So if you have a Bible, you got YouVersion on your phone, something like that, go ahead and open that up. John chapter 2 is where we're going to be tonight. And again, most of you have probably heard something about this story. Anybody ever seen a meme and it said something about Jesus flipping tables? Anybody ever seen anything like that? You've never seen a meme about Jesus flipping tables? I know that is a lie because I've seen it so many times, all right? Well, it's about Jesus because what we're going to read tonight is that Jesus, this guy who was loving, who's compassionate, goes selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So how many of you have heard this story before? Let me see hands. How many of you have heard this story before? Oh, good. We got some new ones. All right. That's all right. Well, we're going to dive into what this story means, but this is one of my favorite stories, just the idea of Jesus walking into this temple and just flipping table. I don't know. Love that. So let's go ahead and get started in looking at what this means for us today and what it meant then for what Jesus was doing. So the first thing that we notice in verse 13 is it says the Passover of the Jews was at hand. Passover was this thing where all the Jews would come together in Jerusalem and they would celebrate the fact that God had delivered them from captivity in Egypt. So earlier in Egypt, in Egypt, but Israel's history, in the Jews' history, they were trapped in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. And God brought them out of that land. Do y'all remember the song Pharaoh, Pharaoh? Anybody remember that song? Yeah, we've talked a little bit about Passover in this series so far, but you all remember that song, Pharaoh, Pharaoh? There we go. Yeah. All right, one more time, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. That was weaker than the first time. Come on. All right, one more. Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Oh my gosh, that is sad. That is sad. It got worse every time. All right. Anyway, they were in Egypt, and Pharaoh ended up letting them go after God had some plagues in store for Egypt and for Pharaoh. He let the people go, and Passover was a celebration of this release. It was a celebration, remembering of what God had done for his people and delivering them. So Jesus, they would get together every year, and Jesus was there in Jerusalem at this time for Passover. And the reason I wanted you to see that and to remember that is at this time, we're about to see, they were selling animals, and the reason they were selling animals is because they had to make offering, they would kill an animal, and they would put it on the altar, and it would be an offering to God as a way to forgive their sin. So today, for us as Christians, we have Jesus. He was our sacrifice. He was the last offering to God for the forgiveness of our sins. Jesus was that for us. But before he came on the scene, before Jesus died on the cross, they had to sacrifice animals for their sins. So whenever they would come to the temple, these people were out there selling these animals, so that way when they would travel from all these great distances, they didn't have to bring their animals with them. They wanted to make it as convenient as possible for the people who came, so that way they didn't have to worry about, bringing a goat along with them. Luke's not here tonight, but I'm sure Luke would tell you, he's like the goat whisperer. Luke would tell you, goats are hard to move around, and they would take them for miles and miles and miles. So instead of doing all that and bringing these animals, they would sell them there at the temple. Not only would they sell them at the temple, but they also had these people called money changers. And money changers were people who would take the money that was brought in from these people, because they came from all over, and they would give them in exchange of the money that was needed for the temple. But here's what they would do. So in a sense of today, if we travel to another country, our money in most countries is not going to be used in the same way that it is here. So we have to get an exchange of our money, right? We have to give American dollars and get euros back, for just as an example. Well, they were doing the same thing here. That's what those money changers would do. They would bring their money and they would exchange it for the money that was needed for the temple. But here's what they would do. This was such a big deal because all these Jews were traveling from all over that they would mark up the value of the money that was needed. I'm forgetting the name of it. But they would mark up the value of the money that was needed. So they would make, on average, okay, listen to this, in today's time, in this time of Passover, these people, these money changers, would make $300,000. $300,000 on just exchanging the different types of money. So they had turned Passover not just into a worship or into a moment to remember what God had done, but a moment to make some money. Not only did they use it to make some money, but they had put all these animals and all these money changers inside of the temple, which is where God was supposed to be. God's presence was there and inside the temple, and they brought all these things inside of the temple. And then we're doing all these things. Yes, at first, these things started out as opportunities to help these people worship. They brought these animals that made it much more convenient for them. They had these places where they could exchange their money, made things much more convenient for them. But the problem was that no longer were these people worshiping God when they came. They were so focused on the way that they were worshiping. They were so focused on making it more convenient that they forgot about the God that they came to celebrate and forgot about the God that they came to worship. See, that's the problem in this story, and that's why we're going to see Jesus get so aggravated. And so let's read in verse 14. It says, "In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there." And so the first thing we can learn from this story is that worship requires us to sacrifice. These people made things so convenient, and then they took advantage of the people there. But see, listen, this is what's interesting to me. They made these things more convenient for these people traveling all over, but they made the choice to fall into the convenience and not make the sacrifice they should have made to God. See, it's much easier for them to just travel with nothing, and then once they get there, do all these things, than it is for them to bring it all with them. And so let's bring that into today's context for us. How often do we make things as comfortable as possible for us in our worship with God? And so you see these two chairs up here, and the reason I brought these up here is because I want to give you a little bit of contrast, because some of us are so focused on making our worship of God convenient, making it comfortable. And we say, well, you know what, I couldn't worship in that way. That makes me uncomfortable, right? You know, God's calling me to share the gospel with someone, and I'm going to do that as an act of worship, but I don't know, I'm not really comfortable doing that. So our Christian life looks more like this chair, all right? And like, oh, there we go. And this is where we feel the most comfortable worshiping God, right? And then even, and most of the time, most of us who sit in this seat and say, this is where I feel most comfortable, we're still going, why doesn't this thing lean back farther? Like, this is still not all that comfortable. These lights are really bright. This music was really loud earlier. Why is it so dark in here? They painted the walls black in here. Black is the color of Satan. Man, is this not what we do? We get comfortable about our worship of God, and then everything becomes about us. It's the same thing that Jesus went into the temple to cleanse it of, is the people were so focused on themselves. They wanted it to be as easy as possible. And so the way that they worshiped replaced the object of their worship. The convenience. But see, here's the thing. Worshiping God was never meant to be convenient. It was never meant to be comfortable. And I would even go so far to say that worship of God that's not uncomfortable and that's not convenient, I'm not sure it's worship. But we could be on either side. We could be on the comfortable side, or we could be on this side and we could sit in this chair, right? Like this one's definitely not near as nice. And so what we do from this side of the stage and what we do from this chair is we sit around and we go, man, if I was over there in that seat, I couldn't worship. I don't know how those people do it. Look, they're ridiculous. Look at them. They've got lights. And they've got nice, comfy chairs. They need to be more like me. You know, I would not even have electricity where I'm worshiping. I'm going to get down on my hands and knees in the dirt. Like, I ain't doing it. You got the Bible on your phone? Are you kidding me? That's not even really reading your Bible. If you don't have a family-sized King James out on your table, it ain't real. Right? Like, that's the seat that we're sitting in here, and we look over there and we say, that's ridiculous. But here's the thing. In the same way that the person sitting in that seat was looking for comfort, and that their comfort had replaced God as their object of worship, and when we're sitting in this seat, oftentimes the discomfort becomes the object of our worship rather than God. See, it doesn't matter which seat we're sitting in. What matters most is that God is the object of our worship. So it doesn't matter where you sit. It doesn't matter when we think about, for us right now at CCC, we've got two different services. We've got a traditional service and we've got a contemporary service. And oftentimes we hear people complain about the other one. And see, what happens when we begin complaining about the other one and saying, well, I could never worship over there. Let me just tell you, if you start saying things like, I could never worship over there. I could never worship like that. Listen, the way you worship has become your object of worship rather than the God you're worshiping. See, the problem with these people was that they had done all these things, and God was no longer their object of worship. And so listen to what happens next, though. In verse 15, it says, and making a whip of cords. I don't know how long it takes to make a whip. Okay, I don't know how long that takes, but I'm guessing it takes some time. All right, so Jesus went away from the temple, and he went and he makes a whip of cords. He makes it. He doesn't go get one and then just start using it. He goes and makes one. So like he spends some time on this. Like Jesus is furious. Jesus is furious at this. And then it says, in making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And then he poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. See, the second thing that we can learn from this story is that on the surface, it looks like Jesus is ticked, right? And he is. Jesus is ticked. But here's the thing that jumped out to me. That he did this in the most gracious way that he possibly could. You want to know why I say that? Because what Jesus could have done is he could have walked away. He could have ignored all of it and walked away and said, I can't believe what they're doing. I'm not going to forgive them of this, and just walked away. But Jesus doesn't do that. He does the most gracious thing that he could do, and listen to what he says. He doesn't get up and yell at them and tell them to fix it. What he does is it says that he drove them all out of the temple. And he poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. He did it. Jesus didn't walk away because of their sin. He's furious, but he didn't walk away because of their sin. He didn't leave it for them to fix because he was angry with them. No, what Jesus did is he fixed it. He drove out the sin of his Father's house. He drove the sin out of the temple. What seems like on the surface is this crazy rampage Jesus is going on is actually the most gracious thing that he could have done. And see, I believe that Jesus wants to do the same thing with ourselves. And I want to flip over for a moment. I want us to read together in 1 Corinthians. So if you want to follow along, I'm just going to read. It's only 2 verses, but if you want to know where it came from, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and it's verse 16 and 17. I want you to listen to what it says. It says, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. See, this is all happening before Jesus dies. And that verse comes after Jesus dies. And see, what happened was God was in a temple. God's presence did reside in a place. But through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, no longer is the temple a building that the people would go to be in God's presence. Rather, God comes and he dwells inside of you and me. And no longer is there a building that's the temple, but our bodies become the temple. And see, I think in the same way that Jesus drove things out of the physical temple, he will drive things out of our lives as well. He doesn't leave you and look at you and go, wow, look at that. Look what they're doing, and walk away. No, sin does drive him crazy. But he doesn't leave it alone, and he doesn't walk away from it. No, he does the same thing that he did here in the physical temple. He drives it out. Yeah, he does hate sin. And because he hates sin, he hates to see it in us. But not to the point where he hates us. He hates to see it in us, and he drives it out. How many of you are struggling with things right now, and you believe that everything is up to you to fix? And some of us, listen, I did this too. When I was younger, as I would struggle with things, I would kind of believe that it was up to me to drive those things out of my own life. Those struggles that I had over and over and over again, I would just be like, you know what? I've got to fix this. I've got to figure this out. I'm not going to do this next time. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to find a way. I'm, me. But as we read in this passage, Jesus didn't tell the people to get out. He drove them out. He drove the sin out of the temple. And in the same way, I believe that in our lives, the things that we struggle with are not up to us to get out of our lives, but we have to lean and depend on Jesus to remove them from the temple that exists now, from the place that he dwells now, which is in you and me. We just have to trust him and lean in on him to do those things. And so how do we do that? We obey him. We say, Jesus, how do I get rid of sin in my life? And we look at teachings of Scripture and we see things like confession. And we see things like in James where he says to confess our sin and that through the confession of sin to other people that we would be healed. He doesn't say confess it through prayer and then keep it in the dark. He says confess it to other people and that your sin would be healed, that those things would be healed in your life. But it's through the confession of our sin to others, not through just confessing through prayer. Obviously, prayer is extremely important, but we find in Scripture that he's given us this way out. He's given us this way to get rid of sin in our lives. And so how do we do it? We trust him. And when we trust him, we obey his commands. And so if you're struggling with something in here tonight, I want you to know, stop trying to fight it on your own. And in the same way, allow Jesus to drive it out, but allow him to drive it out by trusting and obeying what he's asked you to do to get rid of the sin in your life. See, here's the third thing that we find from this story. In verse 16, it says, and he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. See, these people started with good intentions. They started in a good place. They really were trying to help people worship. Now, they were skimming some off the top, but they really were trying to help these people worship. And then the people who were coming really were trying to worship. But yet all of it was considered sin. And see, here's why I think all of it was considered sin is because Jesus doesn't just value any kind of worship. He values true worship. He doesn't just value any kind of worship. He values true worship. He values true worship. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 8 through 9, I'm going to flip over and I'm going to read it for you. Matthew chapter 15, verse 8 through 9 says, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines and commandments of men. Listen to that again. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. See, the point in what is being made there is that these people were worshiping in a sense. They believed to be worshiping, but they were just honoring God with their lips. They were just saying things, but their heart was far from him. Their worship was just in vain. And see, here's the thing that we want to take away today from this part of this story, is that God is not just looking at everything you do and going, oh, look, he's worshiping me. No, he's looking for true worship. There are so many scriptures all over this book that talk about true worship, that don't just talk about worship and leave it open and for you to decide how you like to worship and what's more comfortable for you. No, God's looking for true worship. And see, here's the reality, that you might look at people if you're sitting in that seat and you see people sitting over here, and yes, they might be a little bit comfortable, a little more comfortable than you, but they might really be worshiping. They might be truly worshiping God. And if you're sitting in this seat and looking at people over there and going, wow, look at them, you don't know. They might truly be worshiping. And if you're someone who is sitting in one seat or the other and looking across and saying, I couldn't worship over there, listen, regardless of the place you're in, there can be true worship. True worship is not about the place that you're in, but it's about the position of your heart. And so for our worship team that's here tonight, for you guys, if you guys get up here on stage with the intent on singing so people hear your voice, that's not worship. Just because you're singing songs that have something to do with God at a church doesn't make it worship. If you show up, and for those of you who are on our welcome team or you're on content creation, walking around taking pictures or videos or whatever team you're on, if you're serving in any way, if you're doing that so you can say, look what all I do. But then in your own heart, you're saying, look what I do. But when you're talking with people, you're going, yeah, I serve there. I'm on the welcome team. I take pictures there. Have you seen my pictures that I've taken and you see them on the Instagram page? See, at that point, it's no longer an act of worship because our heart is in a position that isn't about worship. It's about us. It's about the things or the act thereof worship. And so for us, what we want to do is we need to get our hearts right. We need to get our hearts in alignment and be true, authentic worshipers. And so tonight, here's what I want you to do and what I want you to walk away with and I want you to think about. And so all of us as speakers, myself, Frank, Richard included, all of us, we're in a staff meeting a couple weeks ago, and we decided we are going to pick one thing for people to walk away with. And this is something that I used to try to do, and I really had gotten out of the habit of. We want you to walk away with one thing. Obviously, I hope that you heard a lot in this message, and I hope that you have a lot of things to apply, but here's something for those of you who are Christians in the room. So if you're a Christian in the room, I want you to look at me. Eyes up here. And this is something specifically for the Christians. If you're too comfortable, maybe get a little bit uncomfortable. And if your heart's not where it needs to be when it comes to worship, listen, worship isn't just music. Worship is a lot of different things. And if your heart is not about Him, if your worship is not about Him, fix that. Think about it. Decide, this is not about me. This is about Him. And see, you don't have to be on a stage. You don't have to have a badge. You don't have to do any of those things to be worshiping. You may just be sitting in those seats, and every week you come and you grab a seat. Listen, even during worship, here in just a minute, you're going to have the opportunity to worship. Here's something for you. Don't be so worried about what everyone's going to think around you. Don't be sitting there going, I don't want to sing that loud because they might hear me if they're in front of me, or this person beside me might hear me. I don't want to lift my hand because then what if people behind me see me lift my hand, and then what if they're wondering about what's happening? Or what, I really want to go and pray with somebody, but then everyone's going to be thinking about me, and everyone's going to be wondering what I'm struggling with. I just don't know if I could do it. See, when we start doing those things, we're making it about us. And God is no longer our object of worship. And so my challenge to you, Christians in the room, put God back in the place. Put Him as the object of your worship. Stop being focused on self and put God back in the place that He deserves to be. And if you're not a Christian in the room, here's what I want you to know, and here's what I want you to hear. Is that Jesus, this Jesus that we talked about tonight, that flipped over tables, that poured out coin jars, who drove people out of a temple with a whip, that Jesus, as wild as He sounds, is madly in love with you. And in the same way that He loved all of us who are already Christians, He loves you just as much. And whenever He went to a cross, guess what? He did it for people like you. He did it for people like me. No matter how far gone you believe to be, He did it for people just like you. Because He's madly in love with you.